In this video, our hero Brick Irwin and his team are going to be travelling around the world through different biomes and challenges to save as many animals as possible from terrible natural disasters like tornadoes and even evil humans like poachers and deforestation. First, we need a base of operations to take care of any injured animals. I started with this ground floor, which has a functioning elevator using these amazing new lift pieces, which look like grey pieces of pasta. I started decorating the interior by adding a small sink area here, as well as the first of many pens to hold injured animals, this one being designated for some cute cats. Next, I placed in this table here for lizards with some heat lamps and a small hide for them to shelter in, as well as an aquarium next to that holding this red crab. I placed a rack over by the door, and outside I placed some more furry friends relaxing and enjoying the sun. Finally, of course, we needed a small toilet, so I filled in this gap here next to the elevator, and it was time to build up the second floor. Continuing that white wall with lots of glass windows, in this corner I placed a laboratory with various incubators as well as other scientific equipment before placing another pen over here with some cute otters and a staff member feeding them some fish. Now we need some desks for the staff to do some boring work, and I placed these laptops on top. In the final corner I built up an operating table with workbenches all around and 2 doctors helping out this poor doggo. I added a fridge as well as a drone and a tranquilizer gun in case of emergencies. There was a small gap here which I built an amazing area for tropical birds. I added the second floor to the building and it fits perfectly around the lift, and now all we needed was a roof, which I snapped into place, and you can see there's a large helipad as well as another entrance to the elevator. But not all of the animals will be arriving by helicopter, so I built roads in the front for easy vehicle access. And now with our base of operations created, it's time for Brick and his crew to head out on some missions. One day Brick and the team were going about some general tasks when they received a call about a poacher in the savannah. For the savannah, I began by cracking open this rescue set, building it up to create this river with animals like elephants and crocodiles. The final part of the set was this epic helicopter which we'll be using to save the animals. Now that set wasn't really cutting it, so I built up this giant savannah layout, placing a river over to the right, a few lush green areas scattered across the dusty terrain. I finished off the palm trees and the savannah was complete, with a herd of elephants moving across the plains, a pair of crocodiles with a nest in the reeds, and an overall flourishing environment. But that peace was about to be shattered. A ranger was doing his usual patrols when he spotted an evil poacher hunting endangered wildlife. He immediately called Brick and the crew and they made their way over, firstly setting up a base of operations to tend for injured animals, grabbing what they needed from the supplies they left to go tackle this poacher. They arrived and Brick and Doug slowly quietly snuck up on the poacher, while Sally rushed over to tend for the injured ostrich. They pulled out their guns and surrounded him, knowing there was nothing he could do. The poacher surrendered and Doug led him away in handcuffs. Brick immediately began checking on the other animals and bringing them over to be loaded up and brought back to base. Luckily the poacher wasn't the best shot and a lot of the animals were still savable, so the doctors worked hard nursing them back to health and they began releasing them. However, one of the elephants was killed, and when checking it out they heard rustling behind it. Going around they found a calf who would surely die if it was left alone, so the team lured it away and managed to reunite it with his herd, and the savannah was back to peace with the balance of the plains being restored. One peaceful, quiet morning in the forest, a camper was awoken by the sound of crackling fire and screeching tires. He turned to see the forest alight with flames and immediately knew who to call. To build the forest, I began by building this cave, which a pack of wolves will call home. Before I created an absolute ton of different trees, using various techniques and colours. My favourite technique that I used was this sideways building technique to create a detailed trunk with roots at the bottom. I then went through building a small river in the middle, adding a ton of different foliage to really give it that wooded feel. I placed the final base plate adding more trees and shrubbery, as well as a bunch of animals like deer, butterflies, birds, bears and more. It was a calm morning in the forest and a family woke up and decided to make some breakfast. But the dad lost control of the fire and the flames erupted. The family hurriedly jumped into the camper van and sped away, but the flames raged on. Luckily the camper was there to alert Brick and his team, and they suited up in their fire gear and sped over. Doug began spraying water on the flames while Sally came down the river in a boat, picking up their camper friend. Brick rushed through the flames, grabbing any injured animals he could find and placed them onto the boat, before going back to help this deer which had breathed in too much smoke and passed out. The deer leapt to safety, and Brick returned to Doug, where they put out the rest of the flames and hopped back into the truck to get back to the rescue centre and treat the injured animals. Next, we're heading down under to make a farm in the outback. I began by adding these dark orange rocky patches to the land, with fences to hold the animals. I then added sheep in one pen, followed by cows in the next, and a few wild spiders, scorpions and snakes around to give that real Australian feel. Next I built a few eucalyptus trees and added them in, a few of which even provide homes to little koalas. With all that built, I put together a large barn with a sloped roof, and placed that here to the right. One day, Brick and his team arrived at the farm as they'd heard reports of some terrible weather on its way, so they quickly began to prepare by bringing the animals into the barn and strapping things down. But as they were getting ready, the tiles on the barn began to be stripped from the roof and everything began getting dragged into the sky by this devastating tornado. Brick and the team jumped into action, pulling out their spiked shoes to give them some extra grip, and they ran outside. He caught a sheep, pulling it into the barn, whilst his crew used nets to scoop up other wildlife and critters, placing them into crates for safekeeping. Just as they thought they'd saved everyone, they heard cries from a tree and spotted a koala clinging on for dear life. Brick didn't hesitate and sprinted out of the barn, using his whip to grab the poor koala in the nick of time. They then hunkered down in the barn and waited for the tornado to pass, and once it had, they helped the farmer rebuild the pens and said goodbye as they made their way home. Brick's next mission had them heading out into the ocean and tackling a massive threat that we see on our seas. So I built him a giant ship, cracking open this set, firstly building a small dinghy with this awesome killer whale, followed by a sunken shipwreck with scuba gear, an unmanned vessel, and a treasure chest with old Viking armor. I then built this mini helicopter before making the ship itself, which was huge, and has a crane to lower the sub into the water, a helipad on the front, as well as a control room with screens and a seat for the captain to steer the ship. Under this we have some bunk beds for the crew, as well as some research equipment. With this built, the crew arrived on the boat and were ready to set out on their expedition. So they left the port and sailed away. They then sent out the chopper to scout for the reef. I built the reef by starting with some large rock sections at the back, upon which a bunch of giant corals were growing, placing the small wreck in the centre here, and adding more and more life, with the floor teeming with sea creatures. Or at least this is what they expected to find when they sent down the submarine, but whilst watching the screen they discovered their worst fear was true. Due to overfishing and pollution, the reef was a shell of its former self. The majority of the corals were dead, and there was little to no sea life left. Once discovering this, Brick suited up in his diving gear, and the team began to plan and prepare the restoration of the reef. They loaded up these boxes with pre-grown baby pieces of coral and began preparing a special serum to tackle the water pollution. The corals arrived at the ocean floor and Brick began planting them around on as many pieces of old coral as they could, as they should slowly grow and repopulate the original corals. The team poured their chemicals into the water to counteract the pollutants and hopefully clean the water. With this, Brick returned to the surface and the team packed up and left, and the reef began to regain its former glory and become a paradise once again. Now on their way back to base, Brick got a call and took a detour over to the rainforest. But Brick would need a slightly more advanced ride for this adventure, so I built him this epic jungle rescue helicopter and will work perfectly for our next mission, with these two massive rotors which can be spanned by a crank in the back, a sizable cockpit for all the crew, and a large area in the centre to transport supplies, set up a mobile base, and save injured animals. Now for the jungle, I began by building this massive tree, using some interesting curve techniques, as well as sideways building techniques to add the first layer of bark, which I then added tiles and plates to make it look a little bit less boring and give it more shape. I extended the trunk up, doing even more of the same thing, before adding vines, leaves and branches to the trunk, which made it look a little bit more vibrant. With that done, I then just had to add leaves to the top, create the canopy, and our tree was complete. And I could add it into our pre-built jungle base plates. And with that, we had a bustling and vibrant jungle, with a colony of gorillas, a waterfall, a tiger emerging from its cave, large trees for birds and insects, and plenty of branches for monkeys to swing on. But this peace was swiftly breached by the loud sound of engines and trees breaking. That's right, the deforestation team were here, illegally destroying this beautiful jungle, killing all of the animals, and leaving many others without homes. But never fear, the team arrived, and Brick swung down on this cable, landing on the bulldozer. He ripped the roof off, jumping in and pulling out the driver, tossing him to the floor. He was then met by the other brutish team members, but with some nifty moves he overpowered them, pulling out his pistol and then chaining them into the tree where they could do no more damage and just had to sit and await their punishment. The team then loaded up any other injured or misplaced animals into the helicopter and headed off home. And now for our final destination, we are heading to the Arctic, where one day a family of polar bears were out on a walk when suddenly one of the babies stepped on a loose piece of ice and was sent hurtling into the ocean. Her mother cried out, but there was nothing she could do to save her baby as she drifted away into the sea. And that's when, by a stroke of luck, a few days later, Brick and the team noticed her floating all alone, hungry and cold on the iceberg. They used the crane to gently grab her and place her onto the boat, where they fed her and nursed her back to health whilst heading back to the mainland to try and find her family. Suddenly they spotted the mum still crying out for her lost child and slowly sailed over, using the crane again to reunite the lost cub with the family of polar bears, and having done that they waved goodbye to their new friend and sailed off home. Let me know which your favourite was of these builds in this video. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and if you enjoyed this story video, I'd recommend you check out one of the ones popping up on your screen now, and I'll see you over there. Goodbye.